So my job here is to introduce the speakers. Tonight we'll have a neuroscientist, a mentalist, and a hypnotist. And they kindly agreed to come here and share a little bit about what they do, and hopefully how also, if we're lucky. Our first speaker is called Machens. He is a German physicist, and he worked in Germany, France, and the US, and is now a principal investigator here at the Champalimaud Centre. Please let's meet him.
All right, thank you. So what I want to talk about is tricking the mind, tricking the brain, all the little things that can go wrong in your brain, the little flaws in the machinery. But before I talk about how we can trick the brain, how things can go wrong, I first want to explain a little bit what it is exactly that the brain is trying to do. Try to understand why things can go wrong, we need to understand a bit what the brain is actually trying to do in the first place. Why do we actually have a brain? What is the evolutionary advantage of having a brain? I think it should be clear to everyone in this room that you don't need a brain to be alive. For instance, you can be a bush, and there are many, many organisms on this planet that don't have brains, and they seem perfectly happy. And they have been around for a very long time. So, what is special about having a brain? Why do you need a brain? So one thing that distinguishes all the organisms that don't have a brain is they don't move. In fact, they can't move. And if you can't move, you can't run away. And that can be disadvantageous. If, for instance, there's an animal, such as this giraffe, that is eating you. And what that tells us that the primary purpose of the brain is to make us move. And with move, I don't just mean to move from place A to B, but I mean move in much more general ways. For instance, while I'm speaking, I'm moving my vocal cords. Okay, so any kind of movement that you make, that is essentially what the brain is generating. But then, if it is all about movement, then two questions arise. First, well, where do you actually want to move to? And second of all, how do you get there? So let's look at how the brain essentially does that. Very simply speaking, so what brains do, more or less, at least, the way we think about them, is that, first of all, there's some kind of goal. Where do you want to move to that is being formulated inside your brain? Then that goal is being taken and experience that you've accumulated during your life, how to get to a particular place is being used, is being combined with sensory information, sensory stimuli that you currently see, the things that are going on around you, to generate movement. That is the basic idea of what the brain is trying to do. So let's think a little bit more on how this works. Let's for instance say that your goal is to go to your favorite restaurant because you're hungry. And your expectation is, since it's your favorite restaurant, that this will really be a great experience and you will have very tasty food. And your plan is, okay, you're here at the Champalimaud Centre, it's a bit too late, but anyways, you start, you go to, say, the Bar where you find your favorite restaurant. Let's say you like French food, so it's a French restaurant. And your expectation is, well, it will be great. So generally what you will experience then is, because you like French food then, you'll get a nice plate, a nice dish, and this is exactly what's going to happen and everything is fine. However, every once in a while, whatever we're expecting doesn't match what is going to happen. So imagine that in your favorite restaurant, the owner changed, and now you have another chef, and that chef is serving the pizza burger. And you're not a great fan of junk food, let's say. So in this case, the outcome is completely different from what you expected. Your prediction of what is going to happen is very different from the outcome. So the next thing that needs to happen in your brain is that you use that information to learn and modify your experience. And this is very briefly what the brain is doing. Now, this comparison of expectations, of predictions, with what is actually happening in the world, that is a very general theme, not just in our brain, in brains throughout the animal kingdom. And it is not just used for learning, it is also just used for constructing the world around us, our perceptions. It's always a constant comparison of internal predictions with external events. So let's see a little bit more how that happens in our brain. And as an example, I'm going to use the visual system. So let's say that you look at this giraffe, which I showed you earlier. Then what is going to happen inside your brain is that the information will travel through the eyes, through the center of your brain, to the back of your brain, where your visual system is located. From that visual system, there are two streams of information. One that is concerned with object location, and one that is concerned with object recognition, and one that is concerned with figuring out where in your environment things are. However, while this information is being processed and transmitted to your brain, something else is happening. And that is that your brain is also generating predictions of what it is going to see. These predictions are generated in much higher areas, much further from the sensory periphery. As neuroscientists, we like to call them top-down. So the predictions are top-down, they somehow come from the top, whereas the sensory events come from the bottom. And these predictions that your brain are generating, they're constantly being compared with the sensory events that you're seeing. So then the question is, well, but why would you actually want to make predictions of what is going on in the environment, rather than just seeing what is going on? Now it turns out you actually need to make these predictions, you need to make these expectations, because otherwise there's no way you can understand what is going on. Let me show you a very simple example. For instance, look at these numbers here. You have 12, 13, 14, and in the lower row you have A, B, C. However, the blue symbol is exactly the same in both cases. So what something means completely depends on the context. It doesn't have a meaning by itself. Someone needs to interpret it. Another example is shown here. So many of you may know this already. What you're going to see is potentially a young woman, the back of a young woman, but potentially you could also see an old woman that is looking to the left, who's either here and whose mouth is here. She's looking like this. So what you see depends a lot on what you expect. And what that tells us is that if stimuli are ambiguous, if the events in your environment are ambiguous, then the ability to generate top-down predictions and expectations may actually help you in constructing the world. So generally, when we think about it then, in neurosciences, we have this generation of predictions on timescales of hundreds of milliseconds that are constantly being compared with the sensory stimuli. And the way we think about illusions is that they are disagreements between predicted and witnessed events. Usually, disagreements between what you predict and what is actually out there don't cause any problems, but sometimes they do cause problems. And that is when we call it an illusion. And that will be my next topic. What happens when the predictions and the sensory events disagree? And I'm going to start with a little video. So I just want you to look at this video and see what the woman is going to say.
Baba. Baba. Baba.
Now please close your eyes.
Baba. Baba. Baba.
Open your eyes.
Baba.
You can close or open them whenever you want to.
Baba. Baba.
What you should notice is that you hear one thing when your eyes are open and another thing when your eyes are closed.
Baba. 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 Baba.
So I hope that most of you got that. So this is called the McGurk Effect. There's a bit of a problem because it always depends a little bit on what your native language is as well. But here's what's happening. When you open your eyes, you hear one thing. When your eyes are closed, you hear another thing. So how can that be? Well, the basic effect is that your visual input, looking and the mouth of this woman tells you that the sound should be something like da or ga or fa. However, what the woman is actually saying is ba. So there's a disagreement with what you're seeing and what you're hearing. And here's where the top-down prediction comes in. And what they say is, well, wait a second, this is impossible. You can't see one thing and hear another thing. And the general conclusion of the human brain, because the visual input is very dominant for humans, is that, well, that must be wrong, and it's probably the auditory input that is wrong. So therefore, the brain is just going to somewhat ignore the auditory input and just tell you, well, you're actually hearing da or tha. When you close your eyes, then that disappears, because there's no longer this visual input. That is the basic idea. When you have a disagreement between two inputs, and your predictive system basically decides on what's going to happen. Let me give you another example. And that is motion. Now, while you move through the environment, there are many cues that you have that tell you that you're moving, that you're running, for instance. For one thing, you notice that you're moving your legs, you feel the running and all of this kind of thing. However, there's a system in the brain, the vestibular system, the system that is concerned with balance, that also tells you that you're moving. That is the system that will tell you that you're moving when you're standing in an elevator and the elevator is going up or down. But you're just standing, but you still feel the motion. In this case, that is the vestibular system or the balance system that tells you that you're moving. At the same time, when you're moving, your visual system also tells you that you're moving, because the visual image is constantly changing as you're moving. So in this case, there's a nice agreement between your balance system and your visual system. But now let's say that you're on a boat. Not so unlikely here in this case. Then the boat, for instance, is moving up and down as it is going on in the sea. So your vestibular system is going to tell you, well, you are moving, right? Because you're going up and down. On the other hand, when you're standing on the deck of that boat, your visual system may not actually notice these up and down movements because you just see the deck and everything is fine. So what your visual system is going to tell you is, well, actually, you're not moving. So there's a strong disagreement between what the balance system tells you and what your visual system tells you. So what happens if you have this disagreement? Well, the visual input tells you no motion. The vestibular input tells you there is motion. And your predictive system, not of everyone, but of many people, tells you, well, that's impossible. The vestibular system is clearly hallucinating. But what happens if the vestibular system is hallucinating? Well, there are instances where your vestibular system or your balance system tells you that things are moving and they're not. And those instances usually are a sign of food poisoning. For instance, if you've drunk too much alcohol, that's a simple example. And the reaction of the brain in this case is motion sickness. So these illusions can have real wrong consequences. However, now I just showed you basically what happens if there's a disagreement between your sensory inputs. But it can also happen that these predictions that you're generating completely overtake and get the upper hand. This is then called a hallucination. And it can happen either if you take certain drugs. It can also happen in cases of complete sensory deprivation. So if someone puts you into a dark room, there's absolutely no sound. Maybe they give you these big blobs so that you cannot feel anything. And if you're in such a situation for a couple of hours, then at some point you will also start imagining things, hallucinating. It can also have a serious reason, such as diseases such as schizophrenia, where basically people can no longer distinguish between the predictions that their brain is generating and the sensory input that they're getting. Okay, so I told you a little bit about how these predictions can disagree with the sensory events and what is happening then. There's one more thing we have to think about in terms of sensory processing or understanding how the senses construct the world, and that has to do with the immense overload of information that our brain has to deal with on a constant basis. Now I showed you these nice pictures where you have the visual input that has like one arrow and the auditory input that has another arrow. But they're somewhat deceiving because in reality it really looks more like this. And even this is a simplification, obviously. You have like millions of input in the visual system, millions of input in the auditory system, and there are all these other sensory systems, smell, taste, touch, the balance system, they all constantly are bombarding your brain with information. And if you do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation, you may see that you get something like 1 gigabyte per second of information that you have to deal with. Not just transmit, which you can do with an optic fiber nowadays, but actually process, compute with extreme complex algorithms. It turns out that even for a machine that is so amazing as the brain, that's essentially impossible. There's no way that you can process so much information at the same time. And the way evolution has found a way to basically deal with this problem is by essentially handling the information overload through attention. So instead of processing everything, what you will usually do, you will attend to certain things. You will pick out certain things. If you see a big room like this one, you may pick out certain faces, but you're not going to see all 400 faces at the same time. And this is what we call attention. Now, let us do a little attentional test with which we're going to test your attention to see how well you can focus your attention. Now, I know that many of you will probably have seen this, so I ask everyone who's seen this before to be quiet at this point, okay? Everyone who's seen it, be quiet, don't laugh, focus. And the basic idea here is the following. I want you, and it's really important that you do that, I want you to count the number of passes of the white team, meaning the number of times these three white girls are going to throw this ball to each other. Okay, just count how often they pass the ball to each other. Okay, I'm going to start. You start counting. All right. Okay, let me ask you. Let's have a vote of hands. Who counted 15 passes? All right, who counted 16 passes? That is the large majority. Who counted 17 passes? Okay, it turns out 16 passes is actually correct. Who saw the gorilla? Okay, that is probably also the majority. So, in naive audiences, basically 50% of the people will see the gorilla, and 50% of the people will not see the gorilla. Okay? Now, let me first show you again the video up to the point when the gorilla enters. So here we have the people passing the ball. And if you were paying attention, you were really looking at the ball of the white team. And then you may not have noticed that at this point, that the guy in the gorilla costume enters. Now, the standard response is, if you did not see the gorilla, to now feel bad about yourself. You're going to say, well, how come I did not see the gorilla? But the truth is, if you did not see the gorilla, in some sense you should be proud of yourself, because you've shown the ability to really concentrate and pay attention to something. You were not easily distracted. Now many of you, especially if they're from the neuroscience community, may have seen a video like this before. So let me ask those people, who saw that one of the players left the game? Who saw that the curtain change from red to orange. So let me show you those events as well. So when the gorilla comes, this woman is leaving the game. And now the curtain color is going to change. So what that tells us is that if you are looking for the gorilla, there are going to be other things that you're not going to notice. Okay, this phenomenon is called inattentional blindness. And essentially what's happening is, of course, while it is great that your brain can attend to certain things, can really focus on certain things, it comes with a price. And that price, obviously, is the suppression of other kinds of information. In this case, it may have been the gorilla, it may have been the background, it may have been some player that was leaving, because they were not important for you at that point. And this is a very general process of how the brain works. Now, you may wonder, can this process be misused? And obviously it can. And obviously people have been misusing it for centuries. And I guess in Lisbon you may also know that people try pickpocketing you. And pickpocketing is usually also where people are trying to misdirect your attention. For instance, someone may approach you, ask you for direction, put their hands around you, which is going to distract your touch, your sense of touch. So your attention is going to be distracted by them touching you. And at the same time, someone else can pick your pocket. Okay? That is a very simple way in which pickpockets will essentially try to trick you by misdirecting your attention. And then obviously the way you protect yourself against that is, whenever you're in danger of being pickpocketed, well, not getting your attention focused on something it shouldn't be focused on, especially on a random stranger. But of course, misdirection is also something that can be used for entertainment, and this is what magicians have been doing for centuries. So they're usually very entertaining people, and they really are able to focus your attention on certain things. And of course, they want you to focus your attention on certain things, so that you don't notice the other things that they may be doing, for instance, with their other hand. However, there's another mental phenomenon in which attention can be very important, and which we'll hear about more later on from James Lynch, and that is hypnosis. Now, many of you may think of hypnosis as a guy like this with a watch that is like trying to magically put you into some kind of funny state, but that is not really the way we think about it nowadays. Rather than being a state where you're half asleep or in trance, we think about hypnosis of more being a state where you're actually very, very strongly focused, where you pay a lot of attention, where you're highly focused, so highly focused that you lose a lot of awareness of what is going on around you. And Vince will tell us a little bit more about this later on. Okay, so basically I've shown you how a little bit about how our sensory world is constructed, and how it can interfere with processes that are basically predictive or attentive, and how that can create problems. But you may ask yourself, well, is it really only this sensory process prediction that can be a problem, or can the predictions themselves be a problem? Can we manipulate your expectations, your predictions? So I want to do another psychophysical test. I'm going to ask you 5 questions, and I want to answer you loudly the answer to each of these questions. They're going to be easy, simple questions. Just answer loudly what I'm asking you. The first question is, what color is snow?
White.
What color are clouds?
White.
What color is whipped cream?
White.
What color are polar bears?
White.
What do cows bring? It seems like I distinctly heard milk here, but last time I checked, cows in fact are drinking water. So what happens here? Of course, this is a joke that some of you may already have encountered in the past, but even if you encountered it in the past, it doesn't necessarily protect you against falling for the same thing again. But really, what is happening in your brain? Why would you answer mid for a question like, what would cows drink? So this effect in psychology is called priming. And although the neuroscience of this is actually not completely understood, we don't really understand what is going on in the brain, at least we have some intuition. So let me explain it to you a little bit. So the way memory experiences information is organized in the brain is in an associative manner. So with that we mean that related concepts are somehow linked in the brain to each other. So for instance, the concept of snow may be linked to things like white, ice, the Alps, the North Pole, or cold, and other things like that. Now, when I ask you the first questions, what color is snow? Then these two concepts, snow and white, they somehow both became active in your brain. And as they become active, other concepts that are related to them become more accessible. They become easier accessible for you in the future. So I'm going to illustrate that by coloring them. So the concept cold, North Pole, Alps, ice, and so on, or the concept milk, because it's white and gray, will all become easier accessible in your brain at that point. And if I ask you about clouds, then concepts that are related to clouds become easier accessible. Gray, sun, rain, cold also white. Easy accessible does not mean that you're thinking of them at that point. It just means that if you think about clouds, then these concepts may actually pop up. Then I ask you about cream, and cream may trigger more concepts, among them milk and white, so that the concepts of milk and white are now really strong in your brain already. Okay, they're very easily accessible. And then when I ask you about cows, then really the first thing, the most easily accessible thing for many of you is basically milk. And since I asked you to essentially answer rather quickly, and everyone wants to answer rather quickly, then this is basically what is going to be spurred out at that moment. So priming basically tells us that recent experience influences the availability in your brain. And then influence the choices you make, the planning, the predictions, the choices, and so on. And it's a well-known psychological phenomenon, which can be used for entertainment purposes. And Joao Blümel is going to talk about that a little bit later on. But it can also have consequences that we're not aware of, but that are in some sense less fun. So in a psychological study about 20 years ago, psychologists did the following experiment. They had a group of subjects that were supposed to do a very, very boring task. Well, there would be half an hour of a psychophysical task that was very, very boring. Now, one group was being primed with pictures of white Caucasian people while they were doing the task, and another group was being primed with black African American persons while they were doing this task. After half an hour of doing that task, the computer screen would suddenly go blank, and the computer would say the task crashed, and the experimenter would tell you that, well, actually, you did half an hour of task, but it wasn't safe, you'll have to redo the whole task again. Now, obviously, subjects don't really like that idea so much. They have to work for another half hour in the same boring task, so they're slightly upset. And what they measure is, well, how upset are they? How hostile are they against the experimenter? And it turned out they were slightly more hostile if they had been primed with these people, with the pictures of black African Americans. And even though these subjects were actually not racist by any kind of standard psychological profile, it somehow still shows that these concepts that maybe society is imposing on us may have a very subtle influence on our behavior. Now, as I said, priming is not really understood in terms of the neuroscience. And even memory is still a topic of investigation at this point. And there are even people at the CCU, for instance, the group of invited aliens that are working on these types of problems. But here's the way that we think it works. So if you look into the brain and you look at the section of a brain of a mouse, 25-day-old mouse, this is 0.25 millimeters, and it looks like a mess, and what you see is all these branches of different neurons intertangled. And you zoom in, that's what the red arrow shows, and you look at one of these branches, And you look what happens in such a branch over a period of 5 days. Okay? Then what you can see is that there are these little, this is the branch, and there are these little protrusions on this branch. And on top of these protrusions, there are synapses that connect to other neurons. Now, in this picture, you can actually not see the other neurons. You're only going to see these protrusions going out. They're also called spines. But what you can see is that sometimes these protrusions will disappear, and sometimes they will appear. Okay? And what that shows is that the links between different neurons are constantly changing. The brain is constantly rewiring itself. And as it is rewiring itself, that's how we think that memories, new memories are being formed, and in some sense also that old memories are being forgotten. So we show that in a little cartoon illustration. So imagine these are 5 neurons. The strength of the link is shown through these lines here. And then the way we imagine what is happening is that new links are being formed, old links may be forgotten, some links are strengthened, new links are formed, and so on. Now, earlier I showed you a picture where these individual circles were concepts linked by links. However, it's not that easy that you can say one neuron is one concept. That's not the way it works. Nonetheless, we think that the way associations are being formed is through the creation and disappearance of these things. Now, I've told you a little bit about how experience can be manipulated to recent events. However, memory can also be tricky. We all know that we forget things, and that memories that are very far in the past may change slightly. But even memories that are much more recent, only a couple of seconds, can sometimes trick us. And here's an interesting psychophysical experiment that we show how it works. Basically, subjects were shown two pictures of female persons. And they were asked to rate which of the two females they found more attractive. So two females, they had to rate which one they found more attractive. They would make a choice, in this case the left person. Then the experimenter would turn the cards around and slide the card that they chose to the subject, which would take just a couple of seconds. Then, in most cases, that was the card they chose. In some cases, however, the experimenters swapped the card. And the card that they would then get is the one they did not choose. Okay? This occurred in some of the cases, the cards were swapped. Now, interestingly, more than 75% of the cases, this was not noticed by the participants. Okay? They didn't notice that the cards were swapped. Even if they had more than 5 seconds time to choose, to choose which of the two faces they found more attractive. Okay, so this is a standard psychological phenomenon. It could be called change blindness, for instance, some kind of failure in the memory. But here's an even more interesting thing that happened in this case. It's called choice blindness. Afterwards, the subjects were asked to state why they chose the card. And since they thought this was their choice, they then rationalized with hindsight on why they found this woman more attractive. Okay? Here you see some of the answers. That's also the answer I don't know, I guess. But since they did not discover the change, they then came up with a post hoc rationalization of why they made that particular choice. And that shows that sometimes we're able to invent explanations for our own behavior after the fact, even though that wasn't actually our behavior. Alright, so this summarizes what I wanted to talk about in terms of how our experiences, our memory, and so on can be manipulated. But there was one more thing I said that determines how we behave, and those are our goals, what we want to achieve. So if we think about goals, we may think about rewards and punishment, carrot and sticks. And we're essentially trying to seek reward. We're trying to seek out things that we find pleasurable, and we're trying to avoid punishment. That seems like a very natural type of behavior. So maybe this is really fixed, and it is given, and it doesn't change. However, that's not the case either. So let's look at a concrete example. Let's make a comparison and study whether subjects prefer Coke or Pepsi. Okay? And this is a study done in the US. And if you basically give either Coke or Pepsi in a white plastic cup to subjects, and then you ask them afterwards, well, did you prefer this drink or did you prefer that drink? So it's a blind test. People just say, I like this taste better, I like that taste better. They don't actually know which one is Pepsi or Coke. In this case, they actually prefer Pepsi. This was long known, and it's fascinating because you would imagine that if subjects prefer Pepsi as a drink, that they would buy more Pepsi. However, that's not the case. Subjects buy more Coke. So why is that? How can it be that in a blind test, people like Pepsi better, but then when they actually go to the supermarket, they buy Coke? That doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, if you change the psychophysical test slightly, and you show people, and you give people Coke or Pepsi in a can, so that they actually see what they're drinking, and afterwards you ask them, well, what did you like better? Then they will say, well, actually I like Coke better. Okay? In this case, more people express a preference for Coke. So you could imagine that maybe they're just making this up. Maybe it actually didn't taste better. They just say it tastes better. However, nowadays in brain studies, you can, in fMRI experiments and imaging experiments, you can image what is going on in the brain while they're drinking that liquid. And what you see is that there's a strong difference depending on whether people drink Coke and know that it's Coke, or they drink Coke and don't know that it's Coke. And that difference shows a lot of activity in areas of the brain that are related again to generating predictions. The frontal areas, the prefrontal areas that generate predictions and expectations. They essentially overrule your taste experience in some sense. So the way you can imagine this is you have this taste input that tells you how the liquid tastes, but then you have a visual input that tells you what that liquid is. And your preference system, your prediction system, is saying essentially in this case, at least for many subjects, it's Coke, it must be good. And whatever this taste system is saying, it's, we don't actually know whether it modifies the taste. I don't necessarily think it modifies the taste, but it certainly modifies the experience, pleasure, or value of that particular drink. So here again, your predictive system is basically overruling the sensory system, but this time in terms of the goals and so on that you have. Well, this, of course, was known for a while by an advertising agency, and the reason you think that Coke is so much better is because, well, this brand name has been developed over more than 100 years. And there was a long advertisement campaign in the 80s, it's called the Cola Wars between Coke and Pepsi, where Pepsi was trying to basically establish their brand name to the same level as Coke. Okay? So what it tells us is that, yes, advertisement actually works. That shouldn't come as a big surprise, because why would people spend so much money on advertisement? But advertisement does change our goals. It changes the way we perceive things and the way we take pleasure from things. I want to give you one last example that may be less intuitive than what I just showed you. And this has to do with subscription from a magazine. It's The Economist. The Economist is a British magazine. And here's the subscription ad they had at some point. They offer you 3 subscriptions. One subscription is you get a 1-year subscription, only the internet, for $59. Another possibility is you buy the print edition of The Economist, and that costs you $125. Or you buy the print and internet subscription, which also costs $125. So that's odd, because in fact, here you get the internet for free. Right here you only get the print, here you get print and internet, but it costs exactly the same money. Now in psychophysical tests, they would basically take students, a set of students, and ask them, well, which of these 3 options do you want? And the students would decide, and they would say, well, 84% wanted the print and internet subscription, 60% wanted only the internet subscription, and 0% wanted the print subscription. Which is good, because you wouldn't expect anyone to only want the print subscription, that would be odd. Now, What they then did is, in the psychophysical study, they said, well, so obviously this print subscription, it doesn't make any sense. So we can just take it out and repeat the study. And since no one chose the print subscription, obviously the choices should be exactly the same. No, I mean, no one wanted the print subscription in the first place. But what happens if you take the print subscription out? What happens is that now 68% of the subjects want the internet subscription, and only 32% want the print and internet subscription. So what is happening here? What is happening is that this option here, which seems a little bit unattractive because it's actually worse than the third option, makes the third option in turn sound a lot more attractive. It suddenly sounds like a really good deal, and it biases your choice. And this is again a standard marketing strategy to basically give you 3 options and bias your choice by making one of the options really sound like a good deal. Okay? It doesn't mean that everyone is going to go for that, but it changes the way you choose. And with that, I want to close and briefly read my conclusions, which is I first showed you about perception illusions, which basically arise when our expectations and predictions interfere with our perception of the sensory unit. Attentional blindness, which was the gorilla, which happens when you strongly focus your attention, which in turn leads you to ignore other events. Priming, which happens when things that are happening in the environment that create recent experience will influence what you're going to think about next, what choices you're going to make next. And then last but not least, the relativity of values, that is how much we value things, which is largely influenced by the context in which they appear. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time, probably yet. We have time for just a couple of questions. And preguntas in português são bem-vindas. In Italian, French, or whatever, I'll help translate.
I'm just curious. In the preference test, when they chose between 1 or 2 photos of women, how much time did they have to look at the women?
So there were 2 different scenarios. So in this case, they put them into 3 groups. So when they only made that choice in 2 seconds, when they made that choice within 5 seconds, or when they took a bit longer than 5 seconds.
So they did not detect the change with more time to look at the photos?
Okay, so there are several things you have to remember. First of all, 25% of the people actually detect the change. Second of all, whenever someone detected the change, they were actually taken out of the experiment for a very simple reason. Because once they detect the change, they become very distrustful of the experiment. So they become more alert to the fact that there may be another, so their change detection will easily increase. The other thing you have to see is that, because also it sounds counterintuitive, in most cases there was no change. Okay, so they would get actually the picture that they chose. And so if you start out with this, the subject will generally develop trust with the experimenter. Okay, and all these kind of things, like the trust they develop, the fact that everything has been working fine so far, may then just lead to the fact that, well, actually they don't notice that the picture changed. So the other thing is also that there were 2 tests, one where the pictures were similar and one where the pictures were dissimilar. And I also think what is important to notice is that obviously they also chose 2 pictures which you would probably rate with somewhat similar attractiveness, because otherwise I would also think it's like a highly attractive person and a very unattractive person, they would probably notice the change much easier as well.
So would you call trust a form of prediction of the mind?
Yeah, trust is also a form of expectations that you're constructing as you basically interact with the person.
I'm intrigued about one thing when it comes to these ways that our minds are tricked, and it's especially what comes to about priming and hence the prejudice or the attention blindness and when marketing comes into play, and the way that our present society is being eluded. I don't want to say manipulated because it sounds like there is a purpose behind it, but at least eluded. For instance, one of the most recent cases was in the match between Germany when you guys lost the Euro Cup. And they played in the end when they were making like a resume of the match. They showed the image of a German woman crying after one of the goals. When in that case the picture was taken when the anthem of Germany was sang. And do you see this kind of awareness towards the way our brain works? In my opinion, should be raised to the channel population, not going to the 400 of it.
I certainly agree that we should be aware that we are being manipulated constantly by television and so on. But then we should also be aware we're constantly manipulated by all the persons that are around us. Maybe we wouldn't call it manipulation, because manipulation has this kind of secrecy, just influence. We're always influenced by everyone we're around with.
But do you think it can be legislated in some way?
Sorry, it can be what?
Legislated. So it can be the prevention of these mechanisms of controls.
That I'm not so sure of. I guess we would have to invent a very good legislation. Because this is really the way the brain also works. And in some sense, most of us are not so much aware of it, but neither are necessarily the journalists, right? They go for an image that sells very well in that case. So I think it's a very complicated problem. I think as we may understand these issues a little bit better, we may eventually find ways of dealing with them in a smarter way. But at this point, I can't really give you an answer of how you would resolve problems that these problems create in the larger society.
Good evening. I would like to know in the ADD, the attention deficit disorder phenomenon, how does the attentional blindness work? Is it similar to people, or there's some difference?
So I don't know about this, where people study that. So if you have an attention deficit disorder, how it works. I can only guess. So I would guess if you have a disorder of paying attention, then you're not going to pay attention to, for instance, the task that you're going to be given, and in which case you will probably easily detect the gorilla, unless you don't even pay attention to the video at all. But it's really that you have to, to not detect the gorilla, it's very important that you really pay attention to the task. And then it's also there's the personal trade-off, like if you're more easily distracted or less easily distracted, these are kind of trade-offs, like being more easily distracted can also be an advantage, right? Being less easily distracted will be an advantage in certain cases.
Okay, so that was the last question. Let's thank Christian again.